explosive plagiarism saga of former Harvard President Claudine Gay appears to have come to a close. So you'll notice I said former there because yesterday Gay announced she was resigning her position effective immediately. Gay's resignation means that she has had the shortest tenure of any Harvard president at just 6 months and 2 days. Now, Gay publicly posted her letter of resignation, writing, quote, "After consultation with members of the corporation, it has become clear that it's in the best interest of Harvard for me to resign so that our community can navigate this moment of extraordinary challenge with a focus on the institution rather than any individual." Gay added that it has been distressing to have doubt cast on my commitments to confronting hate and to upholding scholarly rigor, two bedrock values that are fundamental to who I am, and frightening to be subjected to personal attacks and threats fueled by racial animus.
Conservatives took a victory lap following Gay's announcement. Manhattan Institute senior fellow Chris Rufo, who likely played a key role in Gay's ousting, tweeted, "Rather than take responsibility for minimizing anti-Semitism, committing serial plagiarism, intimidating the free press, and damaging the institution, she calls her critics racist. This is the poison of DEI ideology. Glad she's gone." New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who led the initial hearing that landed Gay in hot water, posted, "Two down, Harvard knows that this long overdue forced resignation of the anti-Semitic plagiarist president is just the beginning of what will be the greatest scandal of any college or university in history."
Al Sharpton had choice words on Gay's firing, vowing to protest her opponents and claiming that racism was responsible, and he was hardly the only one there. Fox News reported this. Let's watch.
Sharpton saying, quote, "This is an attack on every black woman in this country who's put a crack in the glass ceiling. It's an assault on the health, strength, and future of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Would we only be so lucky?"
Here now to discuss is Steven Thrasher, author of The Viral Underclass, which is just out in softcover yesterday. The rest of the title is The Human Toll of When Inequality and Disease Collide. And then he's also the Daniel H. Renberg Chair of Social Justice and Reporting at Northwestern University. Welcome to the show, Doctor.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Dr. Thrasher, you're on today because you did a viral thread yesterday, and no pun intended with your book title, in which you took a take that I didn't see very often reflected. You pointed out that despite the perception that Claudine Gay was fired for doing too much to defend the free speech rights of pro-Palestinian advocates on Harvard campus, that in fact, she was pretty middling in that role. Can you elaborate?
Certainly. I've been watching this case over the past couple of months, and I predicted that it would end exactly as it ended yesterday. I thought that she was not going to start in the next semester, and you could see lots of reasons why that was building up to that point. But I had been pretty disappointed in her. And I've just been watching her to see what she was going to do in this job because, as you and I have discussed on your podcast and in books like Elite Capture, we've seen the kind of person who comes into sort of a role like this where they're presented as if they're going to be a great person for DEI, that they are a different kind of face than we've seen in these positions before, but they're often put in those positions explicitly to police their own kind. And so when everything started to happen, after October 7th, Dr. Gay first came into the news in my purview when she came down very hard on pro-Palestinian students in speech. She wrote a letter that basically said students shouldn't and faculty should not be using the phrase "from the river to the sea." And she really conflated anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in a very dangerous way. I'm glad just 2 months later, I feel like we have more vocabulary and opportunities to even talk about this. But before those conversations developed at all, she really came down hard on her Palestinian students. And then there was an incident where pro-Palestinian students were being attacked by pro-Zionist students, and a black male student tried to intervene. He eventually got evicted from his housing for successfully de-escalating this situation. And I noticed that many black justice workers from around the world were asking President Gay to step in on behalf of this black student who had very successfully used tactics of nonviolent resistance to de-escalate a situation and was punished for it. And I saw very clearly that she was not going to be helping anyone who, maybe looked a bit like her. She was very much looking out for herself. But when the same things that she was enforcing on other people were turned on her, that's when the conversation turned about race and affecting her job.
Well, look, I've been saying for weeks now that I don't think she's I mean, the problems at Harvard predate her. Obviously, she hasn't been in the job very long, but I've mentioned repeatedly that Harvard is ranked dead last by a well-reputed campus free speech organization that has chronicled violation of pro-Israel students' free speech rights and pro-Palestinian students' free speech rights, and free speech issues having nothing to do with Israel or Gaza or any of that. And that, again, maybe she wasn't given enough time to turn that around at all, but that's a deplorable record. However, I mean, we can't, skip past the part what she's really being, I mean, she's resigned, so she can be resigning for whatever she wants. I think she wants to make it more about the fallout from the hearing, but she was caught with numerous instances of what many experts have described as plagiarism. So does it really matter any of this other stuff, or the reason people went after her when on this the charge seems to fit pretty accurately? No?
Well, of course, it matters why people went after her. I mean, all of this behind the reason we're even talking about this today, of course, is Israel and Palestine. I mean, that's the reason. I don't think that she would have come in as close purview and scrutiny had this not happened. And because Harvard, like so many universities, including mine, including every university in the United States, gets caught up in what's happening in Israel and Palestine, that's why so much of the scrutiny appears. And so I think it is very important to think about and look at how she responded from a position of power in terms of dissent and language and matters of free speech with her own students. And she did not give grace to what students were saying, what faculty were saying. She did not give even grace or even space for the experts on anti-Semitism and on the Middle East amongst her own faculty. They were not invited to be a part of her anti-Semitism task force. And so when she very infamously fumbled the bag in front of the Congress, and when she was being asked about these issues and did not answer very well, she asked for the same kind of grace that she did not get. And then as people started interrogating her record, and I cannot speak to any of the particularities of what was found in her record, except to say that the amount of scrutiny of it did seem to be obscene and should not have been the front page story of the New York Times for multiple days throughout the month of December. And many of us would not want, to have every college paper of ours gone through with a fine-tooth comb, but I can't speak to the particularities of her paper. But the reason why so much of that was happening was because she was now caught up in what was happening between Israel and Palestine. And there was a real difference, as I said, in the way the way she talked to her faculty and students and the way that she was talked to. And even though she very hard, I think, from what we see publicly, she seemed to try very, very hard to appease the people who were telling her you need to crack down on anti-Palestinian speech and you need to take a pro-Israel stance. And even though she did that, she still ended up falling herself because no dissent is allowed around this issue. And so a lot of focus came on her past record, but that's the kind of focus that we've never seen of any kind of president before.
Well, we have actually seen some precedent for this. I was reminded that Neil Gorsuch, during his confirmation process, was found to have plagiarized extensively as well, and people were recirculating the highlighted portions of his work, which showed that he succumbed to these same issues. Charles Ogletree similarly faced charges of plagiarism, and of course, quite notoriously, Alan Dershowitz as well, without any of the same kind of repercussions for them having done so. And to Robbie's question and point as well, when you have Elise Stefanik, who was again one of the architects of what happened at the hearing, saying 1 down, 2 to go, well, the others don't have any. There's no evidence that any of them similarly had any kind of academic misconduct, but the implication seems that we're going to keep digging until we find some pretext to get rid of them, not because something we know exists, but because we know that their stated positions on Israel-Palestine, despite being relatively milquetoast from the perspective of the left, are too sympathetic to Palestinian voices on campus for the liking of, again, I don't want to erase this from this dynamic, the billionaire donors who threatened to withdraw money from Harvard and the other well-funded interest groups that are really driving this campaign. I also want to give you a chance just to weigh in lastly on what I think of as a left critique of identity politics. The right's target on DEI seems to be, well, I don't want to cast aspersions, but largely a critique of diversity in the workplace, any kind of diversity initiative to try to rectify what is, for the entire history of this country, a preference for white people, white men, and specifically holding positions of power to the exclusions of others based on prejudice. A left critique of DEI and identity politics goes to what you were talking about before, the idea that people like like Claudine Gay are put in these positions to make it seem like the university is actually attendant to the interest of a more diverse community at the same time that they carry water for the same kind of elite billionaire interests that are driving all of the decision making of the rest of the university. And I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in on how people should be thinking about this as they're looking at this play out, and they're looking at racial tropes being weaponized in certain kinds of ways, and they're looking at what seems like a very bad faith attack at the same time that they don't really have an alliance of interest with Claudine Gay as a human being. How do we tease that apart without coming off as like, as Al Sharpton does, and generalizing Claudine Gay, one of the most elite privileged black women in the world, to the plight that is very different being experienced by other black women and other working class and poor women across the country?
So I think there are really two important things to keep in mind as we look at this, because this dynamic is going to play out again. If they can take down the president of Harvard, they can take down almost anyone in academia. And my interest is less about her personally, but knowing that they were successful with her, that means they can come after anyone. And as you said, with a variety of reasons why. It doesn't have to be plagiarism. They can just kind of keep scrutinizing until they try to find something. So one dynamic I think is important to look at is to understand that Claudine Gay, as a black woman and the president of Harvard, is only one kind of black woman who works at Harvard, right? And university presidents, one of their major things they're there to do is to manage money and manage finance. They're almost always going to try to bust unions. And so there are lots of black women who are in service worker unions at universities. They work in kitchens, they work in cleaning, they're also professors, they're also staff, they're also students. And so Claudine Gay is only one kind, and it's important not to conflate and think about the problems that she's facing and to necessarily think that those are more important or different than, say, service workers, faculty, or staff who are also black women and facing the same and even worse conditions that black women face in the workplace. The other thing that I think is really, really important to think about and understand right now is that whatever the right is doing, they could not do without what we think of as classical liberals, right? Like Christopher Rufo could not have been successful, as he very clearly said he wanted to be, in getting Claudine Gay to go if the New York Times hadn't played ball and put, however many dozens of stories about her on the front page. And so as we think about what's happening going forward from this successful ouster of this president and the way that that's going to be turned on other professors, but also on unions, on other kinds of workers around the country, we have to be very, very critical of the role of organizations like the New York Times, making that happen, not just at the level of opinion writing and ed boards, but on the disproportionate amount of reporting that goes into them. There's a disproportionate amount of scrutiny that looked at Claudine Gay's record from decades ago, and there's a way, way disproportionate amount of scrutiny looking at her, the president of Penn, the president of MIT. At the same time, there's very, very little coverage around this issue of Israel and Palestine, say, on how the UAW has passed the ceasefire resolution, and the Postal Workers Union. These major unions have done so. And the press is very much focusing on a handful of elites that gives us really just a subset of ideas of what's going on, while other much broader, more important things are happening that are affecting many more workers, many more faculty, many more students.
I mean, I'm afraid I must push back. Look, everyone could have more comprehensive coverage of everything on the planet, and we can sit here all day and critique how many of what headlines there are, which usually correspond to what is performing most successfully on the pages, which reflects what the audience wants to read. And no media company will consistently deliver things that their audience doesn't want to read. That's just the realities of the business. But anyway, you said they could keep at this until they could get rid of anyone in academia. Does that mean everyone in academia is a plagiarist? And you, Brianna, proposed several other examples of not conservatives. Conservatives didn't invent plagiarism charges. It's happened over and over again where liberal and mainstream and progressive people have pursued plagiarism accusations against people like Gorsuch. Are we to reject those because those are politically motivated. As I said yesterday, everything is politically motivated, and thus we must deal with the charges themselves. She does appear to be guilty of exactly what she was accused of. So I don't understand excusing this because
Robbie, so was Gorsuch. Gorsuch was also guilty of what he was accused of.
Okay, but by your logic, I should ignore that because that was politically motivated.
The question is, why were there no consequences for Gorsuch, but there are consequences for Claudine Gay? Why is there no consequences for Alan Dershowitz, but there were consequences for Claudine Gay? That's why you can't extract the rationale, the motivation for these inquiries. I have agreed with you. You can look at the writing of every single professor, president at Harvard or any other university. If you're genuinely interested in academic integrity, you would of course be motivated to do a holistic evaluation. But what we're doing now is the equivalent of an academic...
The guest has said there's too much coverage of this one specific case.
I want Dr. Thrasher to respond to that.
No, that's not... No. I reject the premise of how you said what I said. I said that they can keep doing more and more scrutiny to try to get rid of everyone. I did not say everyone's a plagiarist. I did not say I'm a plagiarist. But I particularly can say this about people like me who study the things that I do. I'm a Black gay man. I write about gay sex. I write about HIV. I write about very intimate matters. And if the entire media machine wants to go through everything I've ever written and try to find one sentence that they can try to say makes me look bad because I write about gay stuff, that could happen. That's the kind of thing that I think is going to happen going forward. And that's something that makes particularly Black academics vulnerable, which is part of why I'm annoyed that somebody like Gay put so many of us in this position.
Well, and if you got in trouble for something like that, you could come to me and I would write in your defense. I have a long history defending professors and students who have gotten into hot water for controversial or provocative speech, whether they've offended the left or the right. This just seems a totally different case for me because it's an academic violation, one that Harvard should take seriously given that students get disciplined for it.
But she's not a student. And this is, I think, what's really important. She was a student 30 years ago or however long ago. Her academic advisors reviewed her dissertation, didn't just pass her, but gave her glowing recommendations. And now a past mistake that was not caught at the time and not caught at a point in time where she
17 of them?
Could have corrected it. And there were many, many, many by Gorsuch and many much more substantive mistakes made by Alan Dershowitz. And again, the issue is the disproportionate treatment, not the fact of the mistake having been made. This feels like it's tantamount to a kind of academic stop and frisk. If you could say that stop and frisk doesn't matter and that violating the civil liberties of people as they're walking down the street and driving their cars and living their lives doesn't matter because, if you found the illegal substance in your car, then you are guilty. How can you complain? But if you're disproportionately policing certain parts of the population and disproportionately putting that burden on them, that has been found to be a violation of people's constitutional rights.
Conservatives would utterly reject the idea that progressive or whatever ideology you want to ascribe to Claudine Gay are disproportionately scrutinized in this matter when, again, every conservative who publishes a book gets this treatment from CNN-type reporters, and that's fine. They can do that. And I'm not up here saying that I don't know the facts of the Gorsuch case or, frankly, the Dershowitz case. If they were guilty, they should have held
and they were guilty.
to account. Okay, well,
and
then
they weren't held to account.
I'm not up here defending them. I'm up here saying Claudine Gay is clearly guilty and should be held to account.
Dr. Thrasher, I just also want to point out, you are saying not what Robbie said. You did not say that Claudine Gay was a progressive, quite the opposite. And I don't want that to get lost in the fray. That this is really, the critique here is really that people like Claudine Gay get held up by these institutions to have a fake veneer of progressivism, of being attendant to the needs of various diverse minority groups, and do not, in fact, hold that role. And yet it is those marginalized groups that have to carry the bag and get all of the public perception of having failed when a controversy like this happens. I want to give you the final word.
And I do as well, and just you can respond to this as well. I'm seeing people like Al Sharpton, who we quoted, Ibram X. Kendi, and others, Jamel Hill, saying this is racism is the reason, this is explicitly an act of racism is why she's being ousted here. And it sounds like that's not exactly what you're saying.
No, I think that there is a way that racism is being talked at now by people who are sort of her peers that was not being talked about when she was engaged very much in the structural racism that happens in trying to suppress Palestinian dissent, or that happens because the fact that percent-wise, so many people who are supporting Palestine are people of color, faculty of color, students and staff of color. And so that is also a matter of racism that she was very much helping to enforce. Now that it's come for her, she and her peers are talking about it a little bit more. But I think that it is a mistake to just sort of take the Sharpton line and say this is only a matter of racism, but also, as you were just saying, Brenna, that the people left holding the bag are going to feel the effects of this systemic racism because she was sort of in this overseer position in between different powers. She thought that she could play the game for her own benefit. Ultimately, it didn't work. But the fallout for that is not going to be felt by her peers as much as it's going to be felt by people in institutions like hers who have much less power, who are sort of downstream of where all this comes. And that is something that is going to be a matter of racism that we have to deal with.
Dr. Thrasher, this has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. The Viral Underclass, now out on paperback. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.